Marcus Thompson had never been an angry man. At 34, he worked as a delivery driver in London and prided himself on keeping calm under pressure. His wife Sarah often joked that he was too patient for his own good. But that Tuesday afternoon in July, as he pushed his 18-month-old daughter Emma's stroller through the crowded streets near Buckingham Palace, something inside him was about to snap. The day had started badly. Emma had been crying since dawn, refusing to eat her breakfast and throwing her toys across the kitchen. Sarah had left early for an important job interview, leaving Marcus to handle their teething toddler alone. He had taken 3 days off work to help with Emma while Sarah job hunted, but money was tight, and the stress was showing. By noon, Emma was still fussing, so Marcus decided fresh air might help. He strapped her into the stroller and headed toward the palace gardens, thinking the tourists and street performers might distract her. The July heat was unbearable, making the already difficult situation worse. Sweat dripped down his forehead as he maneuvered the heavy stroller through the thick crowds of tourists, snapping photos and pushing past each other. As they approached the palace gates, Emma finally seemed to settle down. The sight of the red uniformed guards standing perfectly still fascinated her. She pointed with her tiny finger and made happy babbling sounds for the first time all day. Marcus felt a moment of relief, thinking maybe the outing had been worth it after all. The crowds were particularly dense that day because of a special ceremony. Tourists pressed against the iron gates, cameras clicking constantly. Marcus found a spot where Emma could see the guards clearly. For about 10 minutes, everything seemed peaceful. Emma was calm, the guards stood at attention, and Marcus finally felt his shoulders relax. Then it happened. A group of rowdy teenagers started pushing through the crowd, shoving people aside to get better photos. One of them, a tall boy with a backwards cap, crashed directly into Marcus's stroller. The impact was so sudden and forceful that Emma was jolted awake from the nap she had just fallen into. The screaming that followed was unlike anything Marcus had heard from his daughter before. It was the kind of cry that pierced through every other sound around them. The teenager who had bumped into them didn't even stop to apologize. He just kept pushing forward with his friends, laughing loudly as if nothing had happened. Marcus tried everything he could think of to calm Emma down. He picked her up, rocked her gently, offered her favorite pacifier, and spoke in the soothing voice that usually worked. But nothing helped. Her face turned bright red, and her tiny fists flailed in the air as she continued screaming at the top of her lungs. The crowds around them started to stare. Some tourists moved away, clearly annoyed by the noise. Others whispered among themselves, and Marcus caught disapproving looks from several people. One elderly woman even shook her head and made a comment about parents not being able to control their children these days. Marcus felt his face burning with embarrassment and frustration. He had been dealing with Emma's difficult behavior all day. He was worried about money, stressed about Sarah's job search, and exhausted from lack of sleep. The public scrutiny was the final straw that pushed him over the edge. He looked up at the royal guard standing just a few feet away. The guard was a tall man in his 20s, wearing the traditional red tunic and black bearskin hat. He stood perfectly motionless, staring straight ahead as he had been trained to do. His face showed no emotion, no acknowledgement of the chaos happening right in front of him. Something about that blank stare infuriated Marcus even more. Here he was, struggling with his crying child while strangers judged him, and this guard was just standing there like a statue, completely indifferent to what was happening. In Marcus's stressed and sleep-deprived state, the guard's professional composure felt like mockery. Marcus found himself walking closer to the guard, still holding the screaming Emma in one arm while pushing the empty stroller with the other. He stopped directly in front of the guard and stared at him, as if willing him to react somehow. But the guard remained motionless, following his strict training never to break character or respond to public disturbances. The crying continued, and Marcus felt completely helpless. He had always been able to soothe his daughter before, but nothing was working today. The stress of the past few months seemed to crash down on him all at once. Sarah's unemployment, their dwindling savings, the sleepless nights, and now this, public humiliation in front of hundreds of strangers. Marcus set Emma back in her stroller, hoping that being strapped in might somehow comfort her. But she only cried harder, arching her back and trying to escape the safety harness. The sound seemed to echo off the palace walls, making it seem even louder than it actually was. That's when Marcus lost control completely. All the frustration, embarrassment, and exhaustion of the past several hours boiled over in a moment of pure rage. Without thinking clearly, he grabbed the handles of the stroller and, in one swift motion, hurled it toward the motionless guard. The stroller flew through the air, Emma still strapped inside, screaming at the top of her lungs. Time seemed to slow down as the crowd around them gasped in horror. Cameras that had been pointed at the palace suddenly swung toward Marcus and the airborne stroller. The guard, despite his training to remain motionless, could not ignore a baby flying toward him. What happened next would change everything for Marcus, Emma, the guard, and everyone who witnessed it. The consequences of that single moment of lost control would ripple far beyond anything Marcus could have imagined when he woke up that morning. Guard Daniel Mitchell had been standing at his post for exactly 47 minutes when he saw the stroller flying toward him. In his 2 years of service protecting the royal family, he had dealt with many unusual situations. Tourists had tried to climb the gates, protesters had shouted at him for hours, and children had attempted to make him laugh or move. But nothing had prepared him for this moment. His training was clear and absolute. Never break formation, never respond to public disturbances, and maintain the dignity of the crown at all times. Royal guards were expected to remain as still as statues regardless of what happened around them. They had to ignore rain, snow, extreme heat, and even medical emergencies, unless specifically relieved of duty by a superior officer. But Daniel's training had never covered what to do when a baby in a stroller was hurled directly at him. His military instincts kicked in faster than his ceremonial duties. Without hesitation, he dropped his rifle to the ground and lunged forward, catching the stroller just before it would have crashed into the iron fence behind him. The crowd that had been watching in horror suddenly erupted in surprised gasps and applause. Daniel found himself holding the stroller steady while 18-month-old Emma continued crying, though her tears seemed more from fear than injury. He quickly checked to make sure she wasn't hurt, his hands shaking slightly as he unbuckled her safety harness. Marcus stood frozen in shock, suddenly realizing what he had done. The fog of rage that had consumed him lifted instantly, replaced by pure terror at the sight of his daughter flying through the air. When he saw the guard catch the stroller safely, his legs nearly gave out from relief. Daniel carefully lifted Emma from the stroller and held her against his chest, instinctively rocking her back and forth. His grandmother had taught him this technique when he was young and helped care for his baby cousins. To everyone's amazement, Emma began to calm down almost immediately. Something about the guard's steady heartbeat and gentle swaying motion soothed her in a way that nothing else had all day. The crowd watched in complete silence as this unprecedented scene unfolded. Here was a royal guard, trained to be completely emotionless and immobile, tenderly comforting a crying baby. Dozens of phones captured the moment as Daniel continued holding Emma, completely focused on making sure she was safe and calm. Marcus slowly approached, his hands trembling as the reality of what could have happened hit him. "Is she okay?" he whispered, barely able to speak. His voice cracked with emotion as he looked at his daughter, now peaceful in the guard's arms. Daniel looked directly at Marcus for the first time, breaking another fundamental rule of his position. "She's fine," he said quietly, his voice carrying a slight Irish accent that revealed his background. "Just scared but not hurt." He continued holding Emma, who had stopped crying completely and was now looking up at his tall black hat with curious eyes. Other guards had noticed the commotion and were approaching quickly. Daniel knew he would face serious consequences for abandoning his post and breaking protocol. Royal guards who failed to maintain their duties could face court-martial, imprisonment, or at minimum, discharge from the service. His career was probably over, but in that moment he didn't care about anything except making sure the baby was safe. Marcus reached out tentatively, and Daniel carefully transferred Emma back to her father. As soon as she was in Marcus's arms, the weight of his actions crashed down on him completely. He had thrown his own daughter through the air in a moment of blind rage. The thought of what could have happened if the guard hadn't caught her made him feel physically sick. "I'm so sorry," Marcus said, tears streaming down his face. "I don't know what came over me. I could have hurt her. I could have killed her." His whole body shook as he held Emma close, whispering apologies into her hair. Daniel picked up his rifle from where he had dropped it, knowing that this simple act had probably ended his military career. Other guards were now surrounding them, along with several police officers who had been stationed nearby. The situation was quickly escalating beyond a simple public disturbance. The crowd had grown significantly as word spread about what had happened. More phones appeared, recording every moment. Social media posts were already beginning to circulate with hashtags about the incident. News reporters who had been covering the ceremonial events started pushing through the crowd, sensing a major story developing. Marcus realized that he was about to be arrested in front of hundreds of people while holding his daughter. The shame was overwhelming, but his concern for Emma was greater than his fear of the consequences. "Please," he said to the approaching officers, "let me call my wife first. Someone needs to take care of Emma." Daniel stepped forward again, addressing the senior police officer who had arrived on scene. "Sir, the child wasn't harmed and the father is clearly distraught. Perhaps we could handle this quietly?" It was another breach of protocol for him to interfere in police business, but Daniel couldn't stop himself from trying to help. The police officer, Sergeant Williams, had been working crowd control at Royal events for over a decade. He had seen many incidents, but nothing quite like this. The situation was complicated by the fact that it involved a member of the Royal Guard, a baby, and dozens of witnesses recording everything on their phones. "I'm afraid that's not possible," Sergeant Williams replied. "Assault charges will need to be filed and Child Protective Services will need to be notified. This incident could have resulted in serious injury or death." He spoke professionally, but not unkindly, clearly trying to handle a difficult situation appropriately. Marcus felt his world collapsing around him. Not only had he potentially endangered his daughter, but now he was facing criminal charges and the possibility of having Emma taken away from him and Sarah. The stress that had built up over months had exploded into a single moment that would change their lives forever. Emma, oblivious to the gravity of the situation, had fallen asleep in her father's arms. The day's excitement and crying had exhausted her completely. Marcus looked down at her peaceful face and made a silent promise that he would never let his anger control him like this again, no matter what consequences he now faced. Daniel watched as the police began to take Marcus's information and read him his rights. The guard felt a deep sadness for this obviously struggling father, who had made a terrible mistake in a moment of desperation. He wondered about his own future as well, knowing that his commanding officers would not be pleased with his decision to abandon his post, regardless of the circumstances. Within hours, the incident had exploded across social media and news outlets worldwide. The video of guard Daniel Mitchell catching the flying stroller and comforting baby Emma had been viewed millions of times. News anchors struggled to find the right tone for a story that was simultaneously shocking and heartwarming. Sarah Thompson was sitting in the waiting room of a marketing agency, preparing for her third job interview that week, when her phone started buzzing incessantly. The first call was from her sister, the second from her mother, and by the fifth call she realized something serious had happened. When she finally answered, her sister's panicked voice on the other end made her blood run cold. "Sarah, you need to get to the police station immediately. Marcus has been arrested and there's something about Emma on the news. They're saying he threw her stroller at a palace guard." Sarah's mind couldn't process what she was hearing. Marcus, who wouldn't even raise his voice during an argument, had apparently committed some kind of violent act involving their daughter. She ran out of the building, not even bothering to explain to the receptionist, and caught the first taxi she could find. Meanwhile, at Wellington Barracks, Daniel faced his commanding officer, Colonel Harrison. The colonel was a stern man in his 50s who had served with distinction for over 30 years. He sat behind his desk, Daniel's service record spread out before him, trying to understand how one of his most reliable guards had ended up in this situation. "Mitchell," the colonel began, his voice carrying the weight of military authority. "In your 2 years of service, you've had an exemplary record. No disciplinary actions, commendations from your peers, and consistent performance ratings. Help me understand what happened today. Daniel stood at attention, knowing that his honest answer might end his career, but determined to tell the truth. Sir, I saw a baby in immediate danger. My training told me to maintain position, but my conscience told me to act. I chose to protect the child. Colonel Harrison had seen the video footage from multiple angles. The stroller had been moving at considerable speed, and without Daniel's intervention, the baby could have been seriously injured or killed. The colonel was torn between his duty to maintain military discipline and his recognition that Daniel had potentially saved a child's life. You understand that abandoning your post is a court-martial offense? That speaking to civilians while on ceremonial duty violates direct orders? That interfering with police operations could result in criminal charges against you as well? The colonel's voice was stern, but Daniel detected something else underneath. Perhaps understanding or even approval. Yes, sir. I accept full responsibility for my actions. Daniel had spent the entire afternoon thinking about his decision, and he remained convinced it was the right choice, regardless of the consequences. At the police station, Marcus sat in a holding cell, replaying the day's events over and over in his mind. The initial booking process had been humiliating but professional. The officers had been firm but not cruel, and they had arranged for Emma to be cared for by a social worker until Sarah could arrive. The charges against him were serious: reckless endangerment of a child, assault, and disturbing the peace. His solicitor, a tired-looking woman named Janet Pierce, had explained that he could face several years in prison if convicted on all counts. The fact that the incident had been recorded and broadcast worldwide made mounting a defense particularly challenging. The prosecution will argue that you deliberately put your child in mortal danger, Janet explained during their first meeting. The video clearly shows you throwing the stroller with considerable force. However, there are some factors that might work in our favor. You have no history of violence, no previous arrests, and several witnesses have described your obvious distress when you realized what you had done. Marcus struggled to explain his state of mind that day. The mounting pressure from unemployment, financial stress, lack of sleep, and Emma's constant crying had created a perfect storm. But he knew that nothing justified what he had done. I don't want to make excuses, he told Janet. I made a terrible mistake that could have cost my daughter her life. Sarah arrived at the station in a state of complete shock. Seeing Emma safe in the arms of a kind social worker provided some relief, but learning the full details of what had happened was devastating. The man she had married, the gentle father she thought she knew, had thrown their baby through the air in a moment of rage. The social worker, Mrs. Patterson, had been working with families in crisis for over 20 years. She had seen many cases of parents who had momentarily lost control under extreme stress. While Marcus's actions were serious, she didn't see signs of ongoing abuse or neglect. Emma appeared well cared for, properly fed and clothed, and showed no fear of her parents. This appears to be an isolated incident by a parent under severe stress, Mrs. Patterson explained to Sarah. We'll need to conduct a full investigation, but Emma can remain with you for now, provided you agree to counseling sessions and regular check-ins with our department. The media attention continued to intensify throughout the evening. News crews had stationed themselves outside the police station, the Thompsons' apartment building, and even Wellington Barracks, hoping to interview anyone connected to the story. The narrative was complicated. On one hand, there was outrage about a father endangering his child, but on the other, there was widespread admiration for the guard who had risked his career to save her. Public opinion was split dramatically. Social media users debated whether Marcus was a monster who deserved prison or a struggling parent who needed help. Similarly, Daniel was being called both a hero who put human life above military protocol and a soldier who had failed in his duty to follow orders. Late that evening, an unexpected visitor arrived at the police station. Colonel Harrison had driven there personally, still in his dress uniform, carrying a folder of documents. He asked to speak with Marcus Thompson, a request that surprised everyone involved. Marcus was brought to a meeting room where the colonel waited. The two men looked at each other across a small table, one a disgraced father facing criminal charges, the other a senior military officer whose guard had broken fundamental protocols. "Mr. Thompson," the colonel began, "I want you to understand something." Guard Mitchell didn't hesitate for even a second when he saw your daughter in danger. He threw away 2 years of perfect service and potentially his entire career without thinking about the consequences. He did it because he believed it was the right thing to do. Marcus nodded, unable to speak as emotions overwhelmed him again. "I'm not here to judge your actions," the colonel continued. "That's for the courts to decide, but I want you to know that the guard who saved your daughter is facing his own consequences for doing so. He's a good man who made a difficult choice in an impossible situation." The colonel placed a business card on the table. "If you find yourself able to help him in any way during his disciplinary proceedings, I hope you'll consider doing so. He risked everything to protect your child when she needed it most." As the colonel left, Marcus realized that the consequences of his moment of rage extended far beyond his own family. His actions had put Daniel Mitchell's entire future at risk, and now both men faced uncertain futures because of what had happened in those few seconds outside Buckingham Palace. 3 days after the incident, Sarah Thompson sat across from her husband in the visitor's room at the police station. Marcus had been denied bail due to the high-profile nature of the case and the judge's concern about public safety. The fluorescent lights made his face look pale and hollow, and Sarah could see that he hadn't been sleeping. "The whole world is talking about us," Sarah said quietly, pushing a newspaper across the table. The headline read, "Stroller Dad, Hero Guard Saves Baby." Below it were side-by-side photos of Marcus being arrested and Daniel Mitchell in his ceremonial uniform. Marcus couldn't bring himself to look at the paper. "How is Emma? Is she showing any signs of trauma from what I did?" "She's okay physically," Sarah replied, her voice carefully controlled. "But Mrs. Patterson from Social Services says she's been more clingy than usual. She won't let me put her in the stroller anymore." The weight of this simple statement hit Marcus hard. His daughter was now afraid of something that should represent safety and comfort. Meanwhile, Daniel Mitchell sat in a military courtroom facing a panel of 3 senior officers. His court-martial hearing had begun that morning, and the charges against him were serious: abandoning his post, failure to follow direct orders, and conduct unbecoming of a royal guard. The prosecutor, Major Stevens, was methodical in laying out the case. Guards are trained to maintain their positions regardless of circumstances. The defendant's actions, while perhaps well-intentioned, represent a fundamental breakdown in military discipline. If every soldier decided when to follow orders based on personal judgment, our entire command structure would collapse. Daniel's defense attorney, Captain Morris, had a different strategy. "My client faced an impossible choice between following protocol and preventing potential tragedy. He chose to act on his conscience and training as a human being rather than as a ceremonial statue. No military code should require a soldier to watch a baby die when he has the power to prevent it." The courtroom was packed with journalists and military personnel. Outside, supporters of both Daniel and Marcus had gathered, creating an unusual alliance between military families and civilian protesters. Signs reading "Hero Guard" and "Protect Our Children" mixed together in the crowd. Back at their small apartment, Sarah struggled to maintain normalcy for Emma while dealing with constant phone calls from reporters, legal representatives, and well-meaning but intrusive neighbors. The stress was taking its toll. She had missed 2 more job interviews because of the media circus surrounding their family. Emma's routine had been completely disrupted. She cried whenever she saw cameras or large groups of people, and she had started waking up multiple times during the night. The pediatrician recommended counseling for the entire family, but with Marcus in custody and their finances already strained, Sarah wasn't sure how they would manage. On the 4th day, something unexpected happened. A crowdfunding campaign started. By a group of parents had raised over $50,000 for the Thompson family's legal expenses and Emma's care. The organizer, a mother of 3 named Lisa Chen, had written, "We've all been pushed to our limits as parents. Marcus Thompson made a terrible mistake, but his family shouldn't suffer more than they already have." The campaign sparked intense debate online. Critics argued that raising money for Marcus was essentially rewarding child endangerment. Supporters countered that he was a good father who had a momentary breakdown under extreme pressure and deserved a chance to make things right. Daniel's hearing continued with character witnesses testifying on his behalf. His former commanding officer from Afghanistan spoke about Daniel's courage under fire and his dedication to protecting civilians. His grandmother, a tiny Irish woman in her 80s, traveled to London to testify about the boy who had helped raise his younger cousins after their parents died. "Daniel has always put others before himself," she told the panel through tears. "When he was just 15, he worked 2 jobs to help support our family. He joined the military to serve his country, but he never forgot that his first duty is to protect those who cannot protect themselves." The most surprising witness was Marcus Thompson himself. Against his solicitor's advice, and despite still facing his own charges, Marcus had petitioned the military court to allow him to testify on Daniel's behalf. "I want to be clear about something," Marcus began, his voice shaking as he addressed the panel. "Guard Mitchell is not responsible for what happened that day. I am. My actions put my daughter in danger, and my actions put him in an impossible position. He saved Emma's life, and he saved me from living with the knowledge that I had killed my own child through my stupidity." Marcus went on to describe his state of mind that day, the mounting pressures that had led to his breakdown, and his immediate horror when he realized what he had done. "When I saw that stroller flying through the air with my baby in it, I thought, I was watching my daughter die. Guard Mitchell didn't just catch a stroller, he caught my entire world." The testimony was powerful, but the military prosecutors remained focused on the breach of protocol. Major Stevens cross-examined Marcus, carefully, trying to establish that Daniel could have summoned other personnel to handle the situation, rather than abandoning his post himself. "Isn't it true, Mr. Thompson, that other guards and police officers were in the immediate area? That Guard Mitchell could have called for assistance rather than acting on his own?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "Sir, that stroller was in the air for maybe 3 seconds. There wasn't time for Guard Mitchell to call anyone. There wasn't time to think or plan or follow procedures. There was just time to act, and thank God he did." Meanwhile, public opinion continued to evolve. A video had surfaced showing Marcus earlier that day before the incident, patiently trying to calm Emma while she cried. Other parents began sharing their own stories of moments when they had nearly lost control under stress. The narrative slowly shifted from dangerous father to parent in crisis. Child development experts weighed in on talk shows explaining how extreme stress could cause even loving parents to make terrible decisions. They emphasized that a single moment of lost control didn't necessarily indicate ongoing danger to a child, especially when the parent showed genuine remorse and sought help. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a prominent child psychologist, appeared on several news programs to discuss the case. "What we're seeing is a perfect example of how modern parenting pressures can push even good parents beyond their breaking point. Financial stress, social isolation, lack of sleep, and unrealistic expectations create a toxic environment." Marcus Thompson needs help, not just punishment. Sarah watched these discussions with mixed feelings. While she was grateful that some people were showing understanding for their situation, she couldn't forget the image of Emma flying through the air. The trauma of that moment would stay with her forever, regardless of how others chose to interpret. As the legal proceedings continued for both Marcus and Daniel, an unexpected development began to take shape. The overwhelming public response to their story had caught the attention of mental health advocates, military reform groups, and child welfare organizations. All 3 groups saw an opportunity to highlight important issues through this highly publicized case. The stage was set for a resolution that nobody could have predicted when Marcus first lost control on that hot July afternoon outside Buckingham Palace. 2 weeks after the incident, an unexpected phone call changed everything for both families involved. The caller was Sir Edmund Hartwell, a senior advisor to the royal family and former military officer himself. He had been quietly following both the court-martial proceedings and Marcus's criminal case, and he had a proposal that surprised everyone involved. "Her Majesty has been personally briefed on this situation," Sir Edmund explained during a private meeting with all the attorneys involved. While the royal family cannot interfere directly with legal proceedings, they can express their views on matters of public interest. In this case, Her Majesty believes that both men showed character in an extraordinary situation, one in his moment of desperate action to save a child, the other in his immediate recognition of wrongdoing and desire to make amends. The royal involvement added an entirely new dimension to the case. Legal experts debated whether this constituted inappropriate interference or simply a humanitarian gesture. The public was fascinated by the idea that the Queen herself had taken an interest in their story. Daniel's court-martial took an unexpected turn when Colonel Harrison was called to testify. Instead of condemning his subordinates' actions, the Colonel revealed that he had spent considerable time reviewing military protocols in light of the incident. "Our ceremonial duties are important," Colonel Harrison told the panel, "but they should never supersede our fundamental obligation to protect human life. After reviewing similar cases from other countries, I believe our protocols need updating to address situations where immediate action is required to prevent serious harm or death." This testimony was groundbreaking. For a senior officer to suggest that military protocols needed changing was almost unprecedented. It shifted the focus from Daniel's disobedience to the broader question of whether the rules themselves were adequate. The prosecution's case began to weaken when video analysis. Experts testified about the trajectory and speed of the flying stroller. Their calculations showed that without Daniel's intervention, Emma would have struck the iron fence at a speed that could have caused fatal injuries. The scientific evidence made it clear that Daniel hadn't just prevented a potential injury, he had saved a life. Meanwhile, Marcus's case was also taking unexpected turns. The crowdfunding campaign had not only raised money for legal expenses, but had also connected the family with Dr. Amanda Foster, a leading expert in parental stress and family crisis intervention. Dr. Foster had offered her services pro bono, seeing the case as an opportunity to study and help address the broader issues it represented. During her evaluation, Dr. Foster discovered that Marcus had been showing signs of severe stress and mild depression for months before the incident. The combination of unemployment, financial pressure, sleep deprivation, and social isolation had created what she termed a perfect storm of parental crisis. Marcus Thompson is not an abusive parent, Dr. Foster testified at his hearing. He is a loving father who suffered a complete psychological breakdown under extreme circumstances. His immediate horror and remorse, combined with his complete cooperation with authorities, indicate someone who recognizes the severity of his actions and is committed to ensuring they never happen again. The prosecution had originally planned to seek maximum penalties for Marcus, but the combination of expert testimony, public support, and his own genuine remorse made this strategy increasingly difficult to defend. District Attorney Patricia Wells found herself facing intense scrutiny over whether pursuing harsh punishment served justice or simply satisfied public bloodlust. Sarah Thompson's life had been completely transformed by the media attention. While the crowdfunding had helped with immediate financial needs, she struggled with the constant scrutiny and judgment from strangers. Some people stopped her on the street to express support, while others made cruel comments about her husband and her family. The most difficult part was Emma's ongoing behavioral changes. The toddler had become fearful of loud noises and crowds. She refused to ride in her stroller and cried whenever she saw police officers or military personnel. Child psychologists explained that even very young children could be traumatized by witnessing violence, even when they were too young to understand what was happening. Dr. Foster recommended intensive family therapy for all three Thompsons, regardless of the legal outcomes. Emma needs to see her parents working together to create a safe, stable environment. Marcus needs professional help to develop better coping strategies for stress. And Sarah needs support in processing her own trauma from this experience. The therapy sessions began while Marcus was still in custody, with Sarah bringing Emma to visit him under supervised conditions. These meetings were initially awkward and painful, but they gradually became more natural as the family worked to rebuild their bonds. During one particularly emotional session, Marcus broke down completely while holding Emma. "I keep having nightmares about what could have happened," he confessed to the therapist. "I see her hitting that fence and I wake up screaming. How do I live with knowing that I almost killed the most important thing in my life? The therapist, Dr. James Rodriguez, had worked with many families in crisis. Marcus, the fact that you're tormented by this shows that you're not a monster. Monsters don't feel remorse. You made a terrible mistake. But mistakes, even serious ones, don't have to define who you are forever. What matters now is what you do with this experience. As both legal cases moved toward resolution, public opinion had largely shifted in favor of both men. A petition supporting Daniel's reinstatement had gathered over 200,000 signatures. Another petition calling for leniency in Marcus's sentencing had nearly as many supporters. The story had also sparked broader discussions about military protocols, parental stress, and the support systems available to struggling families. Several charities reported increased donations and volunteer applications. Mental health helplines saw a spike in calls from parents seeking help before they reached their breaking points. Parliament announced that they would be reviewing both military ceremonial protocols and child welfare policies in light of the case. The incident that had started as a moment of personal crisis had become a catalyst for examining larger societal issues. Most surprisingly, Marcus and Daniel had begun corresponding through their attorneys. Marcus had written a letter expressing his gratitude and taking full responsibility for putting Daniel in an impossible situation. Daniel had responded with compassion and understanding, sharing his own struggles with the decision he had made. "I want you to know that I don't regret catching Emma," Daniel wrote. "Even if it cost me my career, even if I face court-martial, I would make the same choice again. She's safe, and that's what matters most." These letters, later released with both men's permission, touched millions of people worldwide. The idea that two men whose lives had collided so dramatically could find understanding and even friendship resonated deeply with the public. As the legal proceedings neared their conclusions, it became clear that this story would end very differently than anyone had initially expected. The moment of rage and desperation that had started everything had evolved into something much larger. A lesson about human nature, forgiveness, and the complex choices people make when faced with impossible situations. 6 months after that fateful day outside Buckingham Palace, both Marcus Thompson and Daniel Mitchell found themselves in the same courtroom for the final time. The proceedings had been consolidated so that both men could learn their fates together, a decision that reflected how intertwined their stories had become. Judge Patricia Waverly had presided over thousands of cases during her 20-year career, but none had generated as much public interest or personal reflection as this one. The courtroom was packed with journalists, family members, and supporters from around the world who had followed the story from its shocking beginning to this moment of resolution. Marcus sat with Sarah and their legal team, holding Emma on his lap. The 18-month-old had grown noticeably during the proceedings and now babbled happily, completely unaware of the gravity of the situation. She had made remarkable progress in therapy, though she still showed some anxiety around crowds and loud noises. Most importantly, she had rebuilt her trust in her father through months of supervised visits and family counseling sessions. Daniel sat across the courtroom in his dress uniform, flanked by his military attorneys and Colonel Harrison, who had become an unexpected advocate for his subordinates' actions. The military court-martial had concluded the previous week, and today's civilian hearing would determine the final legal consequences for both men. Judge Waverly began by addressing the unprecedented nature of the case. "In my years on the bench, I have never encountered a situation where a single moment of action involved such complex questions of law, morality, and human nature. Both defendants made split-second decisions that changed their lives forever, and the court must now determine how justice is best served." She turned first to Marcus. "Mr. Thompson, your actions on that July afternoon put your daughter's life in mortal danger. The evidence shows that without intervention, Emma could have been killed or seriously injured as a direct result of your decision to throw her stroller. This court cannot and will not minimize the severity of that action." Marcus nodded solemnly, prepared to accept whatever punishment the judge deemed appropriate. He had used the months of legal proceedings to undergo intensive therapy, complete anger management courses, and work with family counselors. The man sitting in that courtroom was fundamentally different from the one who had lost control 6 months earlier. However, Judge Waverly continued, the court has also considered the extensive evidence of your character, your immediate remorse, your complete cooperation with authorities, and your commitment to addressing the underlying issues that led to this incident. Dr. Foster's psychological evaluation indicates that you suffered a severe stress-induced breakdown and that the likelihood of recurrence is minimal, given proper support and treatment. The judge paused, looking directly at Marcus. This court sentences you to 2 years probation, 200 hours of community service focused on supporting other families in crisis, and mandatory continuation of family therapy for a minimum of 1 additional year. You will also speak publicly about parental stress and mental health awareness, using your experience to help prevent similar tragedies. Relief flooded through Marcus and Sarah. They had prepared for the possibility of prison time, which would have devastated their family further. Instead, the judge had crafted a sentence that focused on rehabilitation and prevention rather than pure punishment. Judge Waverly then turned to Daniel. Guard Mitchell, your situation presents entirely different legal and ethical questions. You violated direct military orders and abandoned your post, actions that under normal circumstances would warrant severe punishment. However, these were not normal circumstances. Daniel stood at attention, ready to accept whatever consequences his choices had brought. The court has reviewed extensive testimony about your character, your service record, and the impossible situation you faced. Video evidence confirms that your intervention prevented what could have been a fatal accident. While military discipline is essential, it should never require soldiers to watch helplessly as innocent people die when they have the power to act. The judge referenced the broader implications of the case. Your actions have prompted important discussions about military protocols and the balance between following orders and protecting human life. The royal family has expressed their view that your actions reflected the highest values of service and sacrifice. Judge Waverly's next words surprised everyone in the courtroom. While I cannot overturn military justice decisions, I can state for the record that this court finds no civilian criminal liability for your actions. In fact, this court commends your split-second decision to prioritize human life over protocol. The military court-martial had reached a similar conclusion the previous week. While Daniel had been formally reprimanded for abandoning his post, Colonel Harrison had successfully argued for a new category of exception to ceremonial protocols. Daniel would be transferred to active duty training new guards in emergency response procedures, effectively turning his moment of disobedience into official policy development. As the formal proceedings concluded, something unprecedented happened. Marcus approached Daniel with Emma in his arms. The two men who had been connected by a moment of crisis looked at each other with understanding that transcended their different backgrounds and circumstances. I want Emma to meet the man who saved her life, Marcus said quietly. Daniel carefully took the toddler in his arms, just as he had that day 6 months ago. Emma looked up at him with curious eyes, reaching up to touch the buttons on his uniform jacket. The image of the royal guard tenderly holding the baby he had saved was captured by dozens of cameras and would become one of the most iconic photographs of the year. But for Marcus and Daniel, it was simply a moment of closure and new beginning. Sarah joined them, tears streaming down her face. Thank you, she whispered to Daniel. Thank you for giving us the chance to be a family again. In the months that followed, both men became advocates for the causes their experience had highlighted. Marcus began speaking at parenting groups and mental health conferences, sharing his story to help other fathers recognize the warning signs of dangerous stress. His honesty about his breakdown and recovery helped thousands of parents seek help. Before reaching their own breaking points, Daniel worked with military officials to develop new protocols that balanced ceremonial duties with emergency response. The Mitchell Protocol became standard training for ceremonial guards worldwide, giving them clear guidelines for when and how to act in crisis situations without abandoning their primary duties. The Thompson family used the crowdfunding donations to establish a support network for families facing unemployment and financial stress. They partnered with local charities to provide counseling, childcare, and practical assistance to parents struggling with similar pressures to those Marcus had faced. Emma grew up healthy and happy, with no lasting trauma from that terrible day. As she got older, her parents would tell her the story of how a brave guard had saved her life, and how her father had learned to be a better man through his worst mistake. She would meet Daniel regularly at family gatherings, considering him an honorary uncle who had always been part of her life. The incident that had started with a moment of uncontrolled rage had transformed into a story of redemption, forgiveness, and human compassion. It proved that even in our worst moments, people are capable of extraordinary goodness, and that mistakes, no matter how serious, don't have to define us forever. Years later, when journalists asked Marcus what he had learned from the experience, his answer was always the same. I learned that we're all capable of terrible things when we're pushed too far, but we're also capable of incredible kindness when we choose to be. Daniel Mitchell chose kindness in a split second, and it saved more than just Emma's life. It saved our entire family's future. The story of the furious dad and the heroic guard became a reminder that in our most desperate moments, strangers can become heroes, enemies can become friends, and devastating mistakes can become catalysts for positive change that ripples far beyond what anyone could have imagined.